Seth Ackerman, welcome to The Dig.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Your Jacobin article, Blueprint for a New Party, was published in November 2016. Today, what you sketch out seems to me to be coming to life a bit and looking like our emerging political reality on the left. The central argument, if I can take a stab at summarizing it, is that the concrete institutional nature of American electoral politics means that we have to think beyond the confines of this debate that we've been trapped in forever on the left over whether, one, we need a third party, or two, instead, we should work to transform the Democratic Party. And the way we do that, you argue, is by building a militantly democratic and independent party-type organization while opportunistically hijacking the Democratic Party ballot line when we need to. Explain what the problem is with the American electoral system that we need to look at in a clear-eyed way, and what your solution is.
The American electoral system is a pretty much off the charts in terms of its uniqueness in its structure, in its institutional setup. Almost all of, even to the point that almost all of the basic concepts and terms that are used in democratic politics throughout the world tend to have like a different meaning in the American context, in ways that often Americans aren't even aware of. So, for example, I mean, the most fundamental element here for me is the question of what it means to have a political party. What is a political party? People talk all the time on the left about the Democratic Party. Is it good? Is it bad? Can you change it? Who's in control? Who's up and who's down? Often people talk about the Democratic Party as if it were a party in the normal sense that it's used in other countries, but it really isn't. In most places in the world, a political party is a private, voluntary organization that has a membership. And in theory, at least, and there's always slippage between the theory and the reality, but in the theory, the members are the sovereign body of the party and can decide what the party's program is, what its ideology is, what its platform is, and have some mechanism to select its leaders and its candidates. And all of that they can do on the basis of the basic freedom of association, in the same way that the NAACP or the ACLU or the American Legion, their members have the right to do what they want with their organization. In the United States, that's not the case at all with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, because we have we've had an unusual development of our political system, where, to sort of take a long story and make it a lot shorter, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the bosses of the two major parties undertook a wave of reforms to the electoral system that essentially turned the political parties into kind of adjuncts of or arms of the government in a way that would be really quite shocking. You could even say norm eroding if they were done in other countries. I mean, it used to be that when you'd go to college and you'd take like a comparative politics class, it would say, back during the Cold War, it would have something on, what is the nature of like the communist system. And one of the fundamental building blocks of the communist system was that, and what distinguished it from a democratic system, was that there was a merger of the party and the state, a blurring of the party and the state. It was a party state, hyphenated. And the United States is a party state, except that instead of being a single party state, it's a two-party state. And that is just as much of a departure from the norm in the world as a one-party state. So the idea, for example, that in the United States the law basically requires the Democrats, the Republicans, to set up their internal structures the way that the government instructs them to. The government lays out the requirements of how they select their leaders and actually runs their internal elections of who becomes the nominees, the candidates who are going to run on their ballot line, and a host of other kind of considerations, including actually electing the actual party officials. All of this stuff is organized by state governments along the lines of their own rules. And of course, when we say state governments, who are we talking about? We're talking about the Democrats and the Republicans. So it's a kind of a cartel arrangement in which the two parties have set up a situation that essentially is intended to prevent the emergence of the kind of institution that in the rest of the world is considered a political party, a membership run organization that has a presence outside of the political system, outside of the government, and can force its way into the government on the basis of some program that those citizens and members gather around, assemble around.
Even though your analysis obviously parts quite decisively with the orthodox third party approach, I do want to emphasize that they are entirely right about the fact that this is a two-party cartel system intentionally designed to exclude them.
Oh, that's absolutely true. And you can see that in the way that the two parties have set up the rules regarding how other parties can get on the ballot. I mean, the United States is the only democratic country in the world where the two governing parties, official parties, automatically get on the ballot, and every other party has to petition to get on the ballot with, of course, an enormous series of structural obstacles with signature requirements, and then the two parties send their lawyer goons to go and strike those petitions off and keep them off the ballot. This kind of stuff we're kind of used to it in the United States. It's just kind of considered kind of just the cost of doing business if you're operating on the margins of the mainstream political system. But in other countries, again, it would be quite shocking, and that sort of thing doesn't exist. So that on that point, like the purist attitude about from supporters of the third party approach is absolutely correct. But then it's a question of what you do about it, and that's where I kind of part ways with the classic third party approach.
And you call for the electoral equivalent of guerrilla insurgency. Tell me what that might look like, or what it might be looking like right now.
What I hope to see is a situation in which the left can organize to the point that it can strategically and consciously exploit the gaps in the coherence of this system in order to create what would be the equivalent of a political party in every respect, in the key respects. And that would be it's a membership run organization. It has its own name, its own logo, its own identity, and therefore its own platform and its own ideology. And the membership and the leaders and the candidates of that party go out and present their message to the electorate of the kind of society they want to see, with under their own label and logo, and to distinguish themselves the way that the Democrats distinguish themselves from the Republicans. This institution, this organization, would distinguish its political vision from the existing visions of the mainstream parties. And the question is how you fit that within the institutional setup that we have now regarding how the government regulates the parties. So to answer your question about the extent to which this is what we're seeing right now, I think that what we're seeing are initial steps that are being taken by people who I think have this ultimate vision in mind, at least as a strategic destination. And the question is, until we get to the point where we actually have the strength at the national level to frontally challenge the mainstream Democrats and Republicans with that kind of cohesive national approach, how do we get to that point? How do we get to the point where it's a kind of a chicken and the egg problem? If you don't have candidates who are visibly contesting for power under a different political stripe, that it's hard to convince rank and file voters and citizens and ordinary people that you actually exist, that you have a distinct vision, and that you have a message, and that it's one that they should care about. So that's where the sort of catch-22 comes in. Where do you start? And I think what we're seeing now with Ocasio-Cortez and so many other candidates at the state and local level are attempts by especially members of the Democratic Socialists of America to sort of take the first steps of having candidates operating, in this case, somewhat tangentially, but still pretty palpably under an alternative banner. So every article about Ocasio-Cortez mentions that she's a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, that she's a democratic socialist. That is a major step towards the goal of having an alternative political vision sort of beamed into the consciousness of a larger electorate in a way that is very difficult to do when you don't have candidates running and having a chance of winning under that kind of banner. Now, what we haven't seen yet, relative to the vision that I kind of laid out, is that the ultimate steps, and I would hope, would be where we would get to the point that a membership-run political organization would actually have a relationship with these candidates that is much more a relationship with the candidates, and also a kind of an ideological and programmatic coherence um, that's more consistent than what we're able to get right now.
Something that would
So
look
right
more
now,
like an actual political party, like the Labour Party in the UK.
exactly. So you look at the Labour Party and what happened there. That's an actual membership organization. You can go to your local constituency Labour Party, become a member. You have your party card. You have the right to vote on the various agenda items that are there. And what they did in 2015 was they were able to for various kind of contingent reasons, it became possible when it hadn't been possible before. But because of the nature of that party, they were able to have the left of that party project their candidate, Jeremy Corbyn, to the head of that party, and then he was able to impose and cultivate a new party image, a new ideological and programmatic identity. And that's something that where there are levers of power within that party that allow Corbyn and those who have won those fights within the Labour Party to actually impose discipline. We don't have that yet. The Democratic Party itself doesn't have that yet because it's deliberately intended to be an institution that avoids allowing any kind of a democratic membership to impose discipline. And they've of course set up the whole institutional system to make it so that nobody else can either. And that's the sort of trickiness, the problem that we need to overcome. So far, DSA, I think that goal is not quite where we are yet. We don't have the wherewithal quite yet, but we are taking the initial steps of creating a distinct political identity and having candidates who can project that political identity to a larger audience. And I think that's an important first step.
And this independent power is so critical because otherwise we're not opportunistically seizing the Democratic Party lines. We'll end up just running people as Democrats. And you write that this is what organizations like Move On, the style of politics that they get stuck in, which is becomes a candidate-centered approach where the base wields little real power. You write, quote, "In this partyless model of politics, it's the Democratic politician who goes around trying to recruit a base rather than the other way around."
That's right, and that's the goal of the system as it's set up right now, is to ensure that it's a candidate-centered system, because that gives the candidates themselves the maximum freedom to act as kind of brokers between different constituencies. Usually, certainly with the Democratic Party, it's traditionally been they act as a kind of broker between a business constituency or a series of different business constituencies and various progressive or working class constituencies, and they sort of say, well, we'll give a little bit to this side and a little bit to that side, and they balance. And ultimately, it's up to them how they balance. It's up to the candidates. In that sense, the American political parties are not membership organizations. They are essentially associations of office holders. And the point of the organization is to strengthen each individual office holder, to make each politician as sort of to empower each politician vis-a-vis their own base. And what a party does is it reverses that. What a real party does is it has a situation where it's the membership who have the resources, who have control over the resources that the politician needs, and use the control over those resources as leverage to ensure that the candidates that they put into office actually do the things that they promise to do, actually pursue the program that the membership wants. Now, the stage that we're at this point is not yet we're not yet at a situation where we've been able to where we have the power or the political wherewithal to set up those kinds of mechanisms with these candidates. Now, I mean, don't get me wrong. I think that this new wave of candidates at the local level, they got where they are through, in large part, or at least partly, through the work of members of DSA or other progressives in their districts. And they're going to need to cultivate and keep the loyalty of those activists no matter what they do. But the fact is that if you look at the history of left-wing politics, electoral politics in this country, it's full of examples of betrayal. And sometimes you can call it betrayal. You can call it just the times changed. The position of certain politicians over time became more precarious. They had to look for alternative sources of support. Right now we happen to be, I think it's fair to say, in an upswing for the left. our message for various reasons, because of the Bernie Sanders campaign, just because of the financial crisis and the bankruptcy of the existing model of politics, means that we're in a moment where the public is more and more open to left-wing ideas, and events always seem to be confirming our analyses rather than disconfirming them. Times change, and there are upswings and there are also downswings. So when at some point in the future we're going to be in a downswing again, and at that point any politicians that we've managed to put into positions of power are going to find themselves under a lot of pressure and with a lot of incentives to try to find alternative sources of support for themselves, and therefore pursue alternative policies than the ones that we want them to pursue in order to cultivate those alternative sources of support. So, and that's the situation where you get betrayal, or where you get, politicians that you thought were loyal to you, taking a different path for whatever reason, and they face complicated calculations themselves. So it's at that point that it becomes that you really want to have and need to have institutional mechanisms for maintaining control and leverage over the politicians that you've put in positions of power. And that's what political parties historically have supposed to be have supposed to be, is they are the institutional mechanisms whereby ordinary people are able to collectively exert control over some cadre of politicians and the message that they present to the public and the programs that they vote for when they're in office. And if we lack that, if we fail over time, over the next however many years, to build those mechanisms, then I would fear that we'll find ourselves back in the same situation we were, let's say, in the 70s or 80s, where there were times there were politicians in the 60s and 70s who came out of those movements who talked great talk, and sometimes were quite sincere about it, and were put in office by activists or by leftists, by radicals. And then over time, as times changed, they took a different direction, and there was no means that the left had to retain some kind of control over what that political identity was.
This is one reason why the argument for, or why there's a growing emphasis, I think, within DSA to mostly restrict political endorsements to members of the organization. I think that bewilders some people, like my mother, who I think texted me during the Alabama Senate race and asked why DSA wasn't supporting Doug Jones. But there's no real distinction between a proto-party organization like DSA and a group like Move On if you just endorse any candidate that's better than the other in every race.
Absolutely. And right now, those debates are happening a lot within DSA, within all the different chapters, and they're very healthy debates. The question is, what are the criteria that need to be upheld in order for a DSA chapter or for DSA itself to endorse a candidate? And my view is that you want to there's a balance that needs to be struck, but you want to err on the side of stringency, of having stringent criteria rather than loose criteria. For one thing, if for no other reason, then it's a fact that there are already plenty of organizations, progressive organizations that act within the Democratic Party, that have those kinds of looser criteria, that are happy to support any candidate that is better than the Republican, or that is a little bit better maybe than the average Democrat. There's MoveOn.org, there's Indivisibles, there's Justice Democrats, or whoever. And if you're a member of DSA, even you feel strongly that we should support this or that candidate, even though they're not a socialist, they're not a DSA member. I think by all means you have the right to, as an individual, go work on those campaigns, or work for some other organization that is working with those campaigns. But if DSA is going to actually project a distinct ideological and programmatic identity into the political system that doesn't currently exist in mainstream politics, it's going to have to err on the side of stringency. And I think that being a member of DSA, calling yourself a socialist, that's pretty minimal. Because being a member of DSA doesn't require you to support any particular platform on penalty of expulsion or anything like that. It's not a centralist, it's not a Leninist type organization, or it doesn't even exert a tremendous amount of discipline over individual members. So to say, at least to describe yourself as a socialist, accept that label, and identify with the organization, I think those are pretty minimal requirements. One day, hopefully, we can get to a point where the requirements are more stringent than that.
It's not even that I don't think that groups to the right of DSA have a role to play in endorsing these lesser of two evil candidates. There are candidates in Rhode Island this year who I will likely be voting for who I would not want Providence DSA to endorse.
Hmm. Exactly. That's the. I mean, I think that those are keeping separate in one's mind the different objectives that you want to pursue when you're in electoral politics is important. On the one hand, it may be that you have the criteria in mind of simply just making sure that that the policy coming out of the government is the least bad possible. But if you restrict yourself only to that objective, then you end up in the treadmill that we've been on the last several decades, where it's always the lesser evil, which means that you're not giving yourself any means to make the lesser evil any better. Um, and I think that's the sort of impulse and the reflex out of which this massive surge in DSA's membership has come from, was this feeling that came out of the 2016 election, that attitude was bankrupt, that idea that you just support the lesser evil. And so now I think that we're seeing this kind of tentative trial and error efforts by members of DSA to figure out what exactly that means in practice.
The possibility of this more independent base of power, I think, was expressed by Ocasio-Cortez. I'm not sure if you saw this in her debate with Crowley when he asked her if she would endorse him in the general election should he win the primary. And her response was that she would have to go back and ask the people who backed her to democratically make that decision.
Well, Representative Crowley, I represent not just my campaign, but a movement. And I am proud to be endorsed by organizations like Democratic Socialists of America, the Movement for Black Lives, Muslims for Progress, and so on. And as a result, we govern ourselves democratically. So I would be happy to take that question to our movement for a vote and respond in the affirmative or however they respond.
That is a fantastic answer. And actually, I didn't see that. I'm glad that you brought that up. I actually didn't see that. That's tremendously encouraging to me. Historically, because the two parties in this country, as our political system developed, because we don't have the normal mechanisms of party, there was always this bizarre confusion within the parties about, since the parties don't impose any kind of discipline, they have no membership that can impose discipline on their politicians. Then what they had to figure out, what is the sort of minimal requirement that you have to be a Democrat in good standing or a Republican in good standing. And in the 19th century, they came up with this standard that was called party regularity. So that meant you didn't have to be for anything, you didn't have to be against anything. You could be a Nazi, you could be a communist, doesn't matter. What's important is that you support the Democratic candidate in the general election. That was the baseline. And it's a clever system. Because it ensures that ultimately if you keep that standard, then the loyalty is always transferred, is always sort of given up to whatever the image of the party is. So it's a very clever thing. If you require anybody who is running in a Democratic primary to pledge to support blindly whoever ends up winning the primary, even if it's somebody who doesn't believe in any of the things that you believe in, then you've abandoned your independent political identity that you're trying to project, not just in this particular election, but in the political system as a whole. You've kind of thrown it away and said, I sort of relinquish my political orientation and those of my constituents and supporters to whoever the Democratic Party happens to be today. And that is the answer that Ocasio-Cortez gave there is exactly the right answer. And it's exactly the right answer because there's a lot of people probably who tend to vote Democrat for whom that question that Crowley asked her is a tricky question. They'll say, yeah, isn't it your responsibility if you're running in a Democratic primary to endorse Crowley or whoever ends up winning that primary because they're the Democrat? And that's not an obviously easy question for Ocasio-Cortez to answer in that position. And the answer she gave is exactly the right one because it grounds her answer in the democratic ideal of what her vision of politics is. She says, I have to go back to the people who supported me and ask them what to do. And I think that is the precise ground on which candidates need to be answering that question, because it then throws the question back to Crowley. Well, who are you asking? Who's the constituency that you are consulting with when you make these kinds of political decisions? And the answer obviously is just himself and his cronies.
And she reveals in that moment that what he's proposing is sort of this boss to boss transactional thing. And in front of the very people whose votes they're ostensibly campaigning for, she exposes that.
Exactly. She shows that the relationship that Crowley wants to portray himself as having with his own electorate is actually not the relationship that he's projecting. It's really it's really like a boss, like you say, a boss to boss transaction. So yeah, that's not only a very good answer, but I think that that's something that that you know people in DSA who are supporting other candidates, they should keep an eye on that, and that's I think should become a sort of a standard part of the repertoire of the rhetoric.
We've gone over and made very clear that your argument is not that the so-called Democratic wing of the Democratic Party should take over and transform the Democratic Party into a working class party, because that's actually impossible, given that the Democratic and Republican parties are not even parties. But I want to pivot now to the problem with the third partyist kind of third party exclusive approach. And I liked what you said before in terms of thinking about the question of seizing the Democratic Party line by thinking through that in terms of thinking of the Democratic and Republican parties as de facto appendages of the state, because those two ballot lines are by and large the exclusive institutionalized means to winning state power. And so for me, what I take from your article is that an absolute refusal to use those two ballot lines is more akin to an anarchist position. No diss on my anarchist listeners, but because it refuses to any attempt to win state power because of the rotting character of that state.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I mean, I don't think that we should be dogmatic on either side of the equation. I think that we should treat the system as it exists with the contempt that it deserves. That, in other words, that these are really just pretenses. The idea that there's this party that you're voting, in an internal election for when you go to a primary, or that this is like a level playing field where every party gets their own, gets a fair shot. I don't think that we should dignify that pretense by taking it as sufficiently seriously to say, oh, by casting a vote or running a candidate on this particular ballot line, that somehow I've joined a party. That's the illusion that the system wants you to kind of be trapped in. Instead, you should. I actually think that part of the strategy needs to be, as we run these candidates, as we project our message, we also need to incorporate within that a critique of the system itself, of the electoral system, the political system, and part of that is to be very open about how flimsy and transparent we find this whole setup to be, so that if the law says that you have to register as a Democrat and do all these different things, we'll do that because that's what the law says, because that's what we need to do to put our message out into to the public. But we're not doing it because we actually buy into the idea that there is some Democratic Party to which one can have loyalty or be a member or anything like that. But on the other hand, I have to say that there's also the potential for dogmatism on the other side. I think that there are situations probably where it would make sense, in fact, to run an independent candidate. I'm not a big fan of the idea of like.
That's how Bernie came to power in Vermont.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And I think that there are many districts and races all around the country where, because of the specific particular situation of that place and the character, the partisan makeup or whatever, where it would make sense to do that. And that's actually an excellent way to show our lack of dogmatism about the whole system.
I was very involved in the Nader 2000 campaign as a high school student, and after years of initially being involved with and then observing and knowing people in third party politics, I think one of the most major ironies is that third party people, like people who are just their political program is engaging in a third party like the Green Party. One of the ironies is that they're so marginalized as these fringe characters by the media, but you will not meet people who more sincerely believe in the story that American democracy tells about itself, and who believe that by highlighting the contradiction between that story and the ugly reality, that everything will just change all of a sudden.
Yeah, that's something I mentioned in my article, is that the system exerts this kind of strange effect where it in some ways, it's more powerful and more effective in constricting the choices to the two major parties by making it just possible, not on a level playing field, but just possible to have a third party, to get a third party on the ballot by jumping through a tremendous number of hoops and then having very little chance of success. Because it's a kind of a I mean, I know somebody, John Schwartz, made a joke years ago where he said, the Soviet Union never would have collapsed if they'd decided that instead of one party, they'd have two parties that agree with everything about everything except abortion. And in some ways, having the possibility of having those third parties has the strange effect where it ends up attracting kind of like a magnet those people who whose vision of politics it often takes a very kind of literalistic form where if you don't like the Democrats and the Republicans, which is great, we all agree, then obviously the thing you have to do is fight the way they're fighting, is to fight on their terrain and say, well, they've got a ballot line, the Republicans have a ballot line, we'll take a ballot line, and we'll do all the things that they do just like they do it on paper. But in
a way that's structurally built to permanently marginalize them.
Exactly. So it looks like they're competing with the major parties in form, but in substance, they're not really. And it attracts people who have that attitude towards politics. So it becomes more about just the act of putting the third party's name on the ballot and announcing that you're the alternative than it is of actually organizing people, knocking on doors, doing all the kinds of things that Ocasio-Cortez did.
An irony here is that for third party movements of the left, especially for Marxists who are third party absolutists, is that this is all premised on an idealist rather than a materialist understanding of electoral politics.
The ritual of inscribing the party's name on the ballot substitutes for the actual political work of talking to people, putting your message out there, organizing people, having meetings, and so on. And that's definitely certainly not what Marx meant when he urged, the workers to form their own party. He certainly wasn't talking about the ballot line because that did not exist at the time.
I'm Aziz Rana, and you're listening to The Dig, a great place for analysis about where we are, how we got here, and what can be done. It's my favorite podcast, and you can support it at patreon.com.
Hey, this is Dan Denver, the host of this show, who was just asking a guest questions about how to transform society, or something of the sort. This week, we are bringing you 7 interviews, all in 1 week, reflecting on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's victory in New York and what it all means for the future of left politics. We can only afford to put this much work into the show, thanks to you, our listeners, who support us at patreon.com/thedig. And yet there's more. Contribute $5 or more and get access to our weekly newsletter. $10 or more, and I'll send you excellent lefty books in the mail. Okay, that's patreon.com/thedig. Thank you all. Back to the show. As much as Democrats like to this day, blame Ralph Nader for everything, I think it's pretty clear that Bernie running as a Democrat was a far more potent threat to their power, and that the blaming Nader thing is more of like a political ideological exercise to legitimate them than an actual explanation for what happened in 2000. And then you have Bernie, and they've been saying forever, that the left is horrible because they run spoiler candidates. And then you have Bernie running in the party.
Yeah. And, on the one hand, the conclusion that you have to draw from that is that they don't ultimately care about spoiler versus non-spoiler. They're going to oppose any challenger to whatever the mainstream or the leadership of the Democratic Party is, whether they run inside a Democratic primary or outside. On the other hand, when you compare those two approaches, Nader versus Bernie, yeah, the other side is going to hate on you either way. But then you have to ask the question, well, which one ended up being more effective? And having also,
it's not a close call.
It's not a close call. I mean, I remember I was there at Madison Square Garden when Nader had his big rally. I paid $20, and it was kind of exciting for a day. But
and saw Phil Donahue and Ani DeFranco.
Yes, all of that, and at the end of that whole process, one had to stop and think, well, what exactly did we accomplish?
which was a question not asked often enough because it was these cynical, concern-trolling liberals, people who are our political enemies, making the argument that it's Nader's fault that Bush was elected, even though these perennial third-party candidacies that go nowhere are a systemic feature of the two-party system. So it's a bullshit argument. But then the left finds itself defending itself against that, and no one's asking not the kind of blame question, but the what did we accomplish and can we do this better?
Exactly. We end up accepting kind of the premise of the argument, but once we get into those endless arguments with liberals. But I also think I want to emphasize the other side of it. Bernie ran in the Democratic primary, so he didn't take the Nader route. On the other hand, Bernie didn't adopt all of the other trappings of being a Democrat. So he didn't identify as a Democrat. He chose not. He could have very easily, had he been a more opportunistic politician, he could have, the year before he decided to run, switched his party registration in Vermont to Democrat, which wouldn't have any real effect, but it would be, a symbolic gesture that would announce, look, I consider myself a Democrat. He could
a
have
symbolic gesture to quixotically placate MSNBC naysayers.
Exactly. Yes, and he could have he could have done a lot of things to symbolically associate himself more closely with the Democratic Party, and he deliberately chose not to do that. And that was smart and wise, both from a long-term point of view, because it tremendously increased the mass awareness and consciousness that you could have alternative politics in this country that were not just Hillary Clinton versus Mitt Romney or Donald Trump. But also in the short term, I think it helped him too, because this country has developed this extremely tribal, polarized political confrontation between these two-party identities that are often end up being kind of empty identities symbols that people, one half of the country fights the other half on, and it's not even half versus half.
Well, look at how Republican voter ideology has been utterly transformed by having Donald Trump at the head of the party.
Exactly. That kind of shows the emptiness of it. And I say half versus half, but it's not even half versus half. These are relatively small percentages of the country who are actively emotionally engaged in these partisan political fights that you see on MSNBC versus Fox, and huge numbers of people look at this and with disgust, and they see it as empty, tribal partisanship, where people make an argument just because it's their side making the argument. And when Bernie was running in the Democratic primary, he could have easily come to be seen by ordinary voters who are being introduced to him for the first time as just another Democrat on the Democrat team, fighting the fight for that party. But instead, he deliberately took a step back from associating himself with the party and said, I am critical of the Democrats and Republicans. And that, again, is one of the kinds of steps, just like what Ocasio-Cortez did in that debate, one of those steps that you can take to sort of help begin the process of shaping an alternative identity that is viable in the mainstream.
I very much agree with what you said about the way Bernie's non-affiliation with the Democrats, even while running in the primary, the appeal that can hold to the many ordinary people who are utterly alienated from electoral politics in this country. And I think it's one of the greatest political disservices that most political journalism does is just in the way they frame their coverage of any race, a mayoral race, a congressional race, a gubernatorial race, a presidential race, whatever. It's as though any person they stop on the street has this like very well thought out ideological or partisan position on who they're going to support. Where I did a piece on southwestern Pennsylvania a number of years ago where I made a point of actually just including the interviews with people who are like, I hate politicians. And that was all I had to say. Because that's like a very ordinary opinion.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a much more common opinion than somebody who's able to give you the whole MSNBC catechism, from beginning to end.
Or the Fox catechism.
And you look at opinion polls, it's kind of, if you were an observer from Mars, or even from just another country, and you looked at this, the system where it's 100% wall to wall, two parties and only two parties, and yet when you go and look at opinion polls, the public opinion about the two parties has never been more negative, and in fact, the percentage of people who are unwilling to call themselves a Democrat or Republican is at a record high. It has no effect whatsoever on the actual political system, which I think gives you an indication of how rigged the system is in that sense. But it's a way in which it's rigged that's very, very tricky to confront. So I think that those kinds of steps of accepting that you're going to have to run on another party's ballot line, but at the same time making proactive efforts to show that you're not just another member of that team. Those are the steps you have to take to eventually get to the point where hopefully in the future we can actually have a formal institutional identity in a way that we don't now.
And if this independent force on whatever ballot line takes power, then electoral reform that breaks the two-party system has to be a priority.
Yeah, and historically, that's how electoral reform has tended to happen. I mean, so some people, for example, would say we should have proportional representation. I guess that would probably be a good thing. I don't have. I mean, I think that you could go one way or another on that. But the point I want to make is that proportional representation came to other countries not because that's one day politicians just decided this is a good idea. It came because all countries originally had our system, which is just first past the post, and then third parties, so-called third parties, would start competing with those mainstream parties, and the danger of splitting the vote became a threat to the mainstream parties, to the incumbent parties. And it was
which is what just happened in Maine.
Which is just what happened in Maine. Yes, exactly.
And everyone was like, "Well, this is not okay. This extremely dangerous far right person who does not represent mainstream Maine opinion by any stretch of the imagination keeps getting elected."
Yeah, and in that case, unfortunately, it happened by the system getting kind of broken from the right. But hopefully, we could do it from the left. Either way, once you start having a third. A political identity that can have a mass scale, then it becomes a threat to the mainstream parties where they say, oh no, we can't split the vote with them. We need to have some way where people can vote, in a more proportional way or more rational way so that we don't lose everything if the vote is split. So I think that, a lot of people ask me, why didn't you say anything in your article about the need to agitate for electoral reform? And I'm all for electoral reform. I think that would be great. Obviously, I'm totally against the system that we have now.
But it's a cart before the horse issue.
Absolutely. And, for one thing, it is absolutely impossible to really organize around in most cases until the sort of, like you say, cart before the horse. It only becomes possible to organize around it once the political crisis has happened that shows everyone the need for electoral reform. So that's what happened in Maine, and people are saying how can we deal with this problem? In other countries, in the past, it was a Labor Party would be organized. They would challenge the Liberal Party, and the Liberal Party would say, we're never going to win another seat again by splitting our vote in this way unless we change the political system through proportional representation or something. But to start by going to ordinary voters and having this very abstract plan for how this other voting system is going to work, it sounds good on paper, but in practice it never goes anywhere. It's really not possible to organize people around these kinds of procedural issues. So you first have to just try to plow your way into the system, cause a crisis, and then the crisis will help you get the electoral reform you want.
Yeah, Fair Vote is doing excellent work. They will never lead a mass movement.
Exactly, and they're a great resource for information and all the rest of it. But until we actually have radical challenges to the system actually entering the ring, we're not going to actually have that reform.
I want to talk about two other case studies. We talked about the Green Party. You discussed the U.S. Labor Party, which some, but probably a lot of listeners don't know the history of. You write that, like a lot of the rest of the left, it was confronted with, on the one hand, this system-induced collective action dilemma, whereby you need to run candidates to build a profile and thus mass support, because if you don't mount challenges, you're irrelevant. But on the other hand, if you do mount serious challenges, you confront the spoiler issue and are, demonized as a counterproductive pariah doing the work of the Republican right. In terms of stuff that hasn't come up in our discussion of the Green Party, what do you think is important to highlight about the Labor Party's experience?
I think that the Labor Party experience, which was really, it was thinking about that experience that that initially led me to the ideas that I laid out in my article, because in many ways they did all the right things. They were in the they that was the party was organized in the mid 90s when there was a tremendous backlash within the labor movement against NAFTA and Clinton, and including at some of the biggest industrial unions in the country. And so Tony Mazzocchi, who was a great left labor leader of the oil and chemical workers, he helped organize his union, which was a pretty big union at the time, and then a few other large industrial unions. They formed this labor party, and then the question was, you know, in some ways, unfortunately, it ended up being sort of an afterthought. But how are we going to relate to elections? And they never had the attitude, because these are very practical labor people, in addition to being radicals. They never had the attitude of the kind of purist third party, Green Party sort of idea. They always believed that they needed first to build up enough support and only then to participate in elections. But like you said, they ended up in a dilemma because Americans don't understand quite, and it's quite understandable that they don't understand it. They don't understand the idea of a so-called party that doesn't run candidates. But on the other hand, if you're not running if you need to run candidates and you're still a marginal political force, then if you run on a separate ballot line, like you said, you're going to end up splitting the vote, and you're going to alienate exactly the constituencies that you need to cultivate the most, because those constituencies are the ones who are going to be harmed by the most by throwing an election to a Republican. So that was the dilemma they faced, and in retrospect, the organizers of that project, some of them were very clear that they should have they had never really thought through how they were going to relate to elections the way that they needed to, and so the alternative models that I laid out in my article were in many ways intended to offer the possibility of a kind of a third way.
You also critique, not harshly, but I think fairly and complexly, the Working Families Party model as struggling to thread this needle of independence combined with effectiveness. In 2014, they endorsed New York Governor Andrew Cuomo over Zephyr Teachout, who was mounting a left challenge. And as a result, they lost a lot of credibility amongst the grassroots left. But this year, well after you published your article, they endorsed Cynthia Nixon, which led to an exodus of these critical union backers who are allied with Cuomo. What do you make of the current state of the WFP and their trajectory?
Yeah, it's an interesting example, and obviously it is in many ways an exception to the usual political dilemmas that we've been talking about involving the left and third parties, because the Working Families Party has always had its base in New York State, and New York State has this unusual electoral law, or the electoral law is unusual in that it permits these fusion candidacies. So every other state, almost every other state, no party is allowed to place the name of another party's candidate on their own ballot. In New York, you're allowed to do that. That's the sort of the mechanism that WFP has always strategically attempted to exploit. And you can argue how successful they were. They certainly had a lot of policy successes. I think it's kind of a glass half empty, glass half full kind of situation. They had a lot of policy successes over the years using that fusion approach to pressure Democrats to move to the left. On the other hand, it really never kind of broke out of the mold of kind of machine democratic politics. And the proof being that they ended up being forced to endorse or felt compelled to endorse Andrew Cuomo in 2014. So what's happened since then? I think, I don't follow this stuff as closely as some people do, but I'm very encouraged. I think that ultimately the experience that they had where they endorsed Cuomo really, I think, put them in an existential crisis of what are we doing here? If we're just going to be endorsing a guy who in many ways represents the absolute worst of the Democratic establishment that we originally organized this party to challenge, then then why are we doing this at all? And I think that's obviously what eventually led to them taking this other approach and endorsing Nixon. And yes, they've lost a lot of their union backers. But I think that had this happened 15 years ago, maybe that would spell the end of WFP. But I think that in some ways now might be the perfect time for this to happen, of a clean break, the need to make a clean break with some of the more hidebound elements of the labor movement. And also, I've heard that there's some kind of, just with some of these unions, there may be kind of a double game going on, where they withdrew from the WFP because they felt that they had to, in order to stay in the good graces of the governor, who controls a lot of the purse strings that their members depend on, those unions. But at the same time, some of them are actually sort of silently sympathetic to WFP. And I certainly think that they, in the long run, didn't have any other choice. They could not keep endorsing Cuomo-like candidates, because at that point it would eliminate their reason for being.
You do, though, emphasize that unions are key to building this independent electoral power, whether we're talking about WFP or, as we've been talking about, DSA. But in the Ocasio-Cortez case, at least as far as I know, unions did not flock to her candidacy. Do you think that might begin to change?
First of all, I should say that unions will absolutely have to be central to this kind of political project if it's going to move beyond ones and twos, getting Ocasio-Cortez nominated in the Bronx, or getting a couple candidates in Western Pennsylvania, in state legislatures, which happened a few months ago from a DSA chapter there. Those are victories are really important. They build morale. They put democratic socialist politics into the mainstream, but they are obviously nowhere near the scale that's needed to exert a sea change in American politics. There are something like, I think, 3,000 state legislative seats in this country. And, at the end of this process, if all goes as well as it can, if you include Lee Carter in Virginia and those candidates in Pennsylvania and so on, we may have, I don't know, 5, 6 by the end of this electoral cycle. That's obviously, it's far less than a percentage point. It's not enough. If we are going to scale this up at some point in the future to the point where it becomes a truly national political phenomenon that rivals the Democrats and Republicans, there's absolutely no way it can happen without a central large core of labor support, because only trade unions have the institutional scale, the contacts with millions of ordinary voters who are not already politicized, not already ideologically on the left. I think that's absolutely necessary, but it's not necessary to do the ones and twos. You don't need, and Ocasio-Cortez proved that, and so did these other candidates. You don't necessarily need unions in order to get somebody elected, and once you get that person elected, then they could hopefully serve as a kind of a platform. She can, as the socialists in the 19th century used to say, she can talk to the workers through the window of Parliament, and that can be a role. She can be a kind of a tribune figure, and those are very useful roles that we can have until the point where we build things up. But it's true that labor is not at this point in a position to be supporting these kinds of insurgencies. Historically, it's always been when labor is strongest and most confident and growing that it has had the confidence to support political insurgencies. When it's on the defensive, it has very little choice but to cling to whatever resources it already has, and part of those resources are labor's relationships with incumbent politicians. So what we're going to need is more of what we saw in the last few months with the strikes in West Virginia and in Oklahoma and other states involving teachers. Those were actually grassroots rebellions of the kind that in the past have led to real sharp movements to the left among unions, where they will then take the step of supporting insurgent candidates. But it's going to have to be a lot bigger, because we're going to need a lot more resources.
My last question is about how the socialist left should approach the process of really quite surprisingly rapid radicalization that's underway right now. There has been this remarkable movement to the left with, for example, once fringe ideas like Abolish ICE becoming increasingly mainstream, not only on the left, but across kind of like the liberal left more broadly. But in a recent piece in the New Republic, friend of the show Sarah Jones attacked Bernie Sanders from the left for failing to endorse abolishing ICE. So my question is, as Bernie's base radicalizes, how should we approach the national politician who did so much to set this process in motion and who is still likely far and away our best shot at the presidency in 2020?
I think that the answer to that question isn't all that different from from what it was the first time around. I mean, there was pressure put on Bernie in the early days of his challenge to Hillary Clinton on a number of issues, and some of them were more constructive than others. For example, he came around. I don't think it required a tremendous amount of arm twisting, but he definitely increased the visibility of his message about police violence and mass incarceration in a way that was responding to criticisms that he'd received on the left. And I think that on this issue of abolish ICE, I think it's probably early. I mean, I'm not making predictions and I don't have any inside information, but I think it's probably a little bit early to say that he's going to take some sort of hard position at odds with what the left wants on this. The question of what abolish ICE means, even for those politicians who have said they're in favor of it, is still a little bit vague. There's nothing wrong with criticizing Bernie or with any of these candidates. And as far as the radicalization is concerned,
and just a quick aside on that, and to the extent that Democratic politicians to Bernie's right can embrace the slogan of abolishing ICE when what they might just mean is reconstituting basically the same institution under a new name, we should be careful about that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is the thing. Abolish ICE has a lot of, as a slogan, has a lot of kind of creative ambiguity about it, where some people can interpret it as basically saying, no borders.
Bring back the
INS. Yeah, exactly. It could go either way. And I'll be honest, I don't think that that we're yet at the point where there's going to be mass support for the radical interpretation of it, of eliminating borders and eliminating all immigration regulation. But the fact that the slogan has in fact caught on, I think, is indicative that including among some relatively mainstream politicians, is a good sign. And the fact that Bernie hasn't yet glommed onto it, I think it's not yet clear exactly what that means. Nobody has ever mistaken Bernie Sanders for an ultra leftist. So I'm not terribly surprised by that. My understanding is that he's always had a good record on immigration issues, at least from the point of view of immigration focused or progressive organizations. They've always given him high marks. I think that the more difficult question going down the road is when you get into policy issues that are more complicated. There's some issues that political scientists will call them easy issues and hard issues. There are some easy issues that are easy in the sense that it's very easy for ordinary people to quickly understand where they stand on the issue based on their own values. So, gay marriage is something that most people can understand what gay is and what marriage is, what same-sex is and what marriage is, and they can put those together and with their own values and decide where they stand on it. But something even as relatively simple for this kind of policy issue as like single-payer healthcare then gets involved with a lot of complexities, and it's where the complexities happen that it becomes possible for politicians who opportunistically want to cultivate a left-wing base, but at the same time want to also maintain the support of more conservative interests and business interests. That's where they're able to creatively kind of redefine terms and impose a lot of fine print on the positions that they take. And that's where the betrayal tends to happen, is with the hard issues, where they'll say, I'm for whatever the slogan is, and then when the bill gets written, it turns out to be the sort of Rube Goldberg type devices that New Democrats and centrists have always been putting out as substitutes for the radical changes that we actually need. That's where the need for institutional control and leverage over politicians by a real engaged mass membership. That's where it becomes important, is because you need people to be keeping their eye on the ball there, able to spread the word, to get everyone on the same. That's what organizing is getting everyone on the same page to understand where their interests are, what they should be keeping their eye on, and holding those people's feet to the fire, even on those more complex things. So it's the complex issues that I worry about in terms of politicians saying one thing and actually doing the other.
Seth Ackerman, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.